Hi, I'm Deanie and welcome to week 10. This week we're going to be looking at framing stories or frameworks around stories. Framing is a literary method of embedding one story into another, like a story within a story. It has the effect of adding more layers of complexity to your story, making it more interesting and therefore, provided you do it skillfully, more interesting to your readers. So how do you add a framework to your story? A simple form of framing a story is a literary form of creating bookends either end of your story. In the opening scene, for example, the narrator introduces the readers to important characters, the setting, and in the closing scene, it brings the story full circle back around to the opening scene again. This works really well in stories set across multiple generations, where a character from the present can open and close the embedded story or stories of their ancestors' past. This type of framing can be used to good effect in a story where the survival of the main protagonist is in jeopardy throughout, but the author allows the reader to know that they have survived, possibly unscathed, possibly not, by virtue of the fact that they are recounting what's happened. In this case, the story will have started at its end point, so where the person has survived, and the narrative will take you back through the events that led up into that point. A really good visual example of this is the movie Titanic, where the elderly Rose recounts her tale as a passenger on the tragic ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The reader is then time-slipped back to the year 1912, where Rose is a young girl. The elderly Rose interjects every so often to recount her experiences to the reader, and the film ends back with the elderly Rose of today, so that even as the story begins, you know that Rose survives. Another one is the film The Princess Bride, a really popular film from, I think, the 80s. It's a story that opens with a grandfather reading a bedtime story to his grandson in the modern day. The bedtime story is the embedded main storyline, and it's set within an enchanted land. The narrative periodically jumps back to interactions between the child and his grandfather, and the film is rounded off with the grandson having enjoyed the story and the grandfather hinting at a possible connection between himself and the fantasy characters in the story. So here's an exercise for you to try out using the top and tail bookend style frame story. I've got a couple of ideas, 3 different ideas for you to try, or you can use your own one. I want you to write a 500-word story, and idea number 1, feel free to change the character names if you want to. Tally is about to get married, but an event from her past that has to be reconciled before she can walk down the aisle. Use the bookends to show her before the wedding and after the wedding, if she does indeed go through with it. And the embedded story, the bit in the middle, should be that of her childhood event, showing the reader why she's struggling with her decision at this point in her life. So that's the first example you could try. Or another one is Max was pronounced dead at 1100 hours, 1 hour after he said "I do" to Louise. The ghost of Max is narrating the days or hours up to his death. So the story would start with him being dead. And then the interim story will be him answering the question, who killed him? And then you come back to him at the very end. And the third example would be Adoptee Elspeth has been sent a box of letters from an unknown source. The letters tell the story of her as yet unknown past. So again, you've got Elspeth with the box, you've got her going through, filling in the story that's happened, and her back at that same point having been told the story or read the story so she knows what's going on. So those are 3 different examples. Of course, you can choose your own example as well, and I'd love to see what you come up with. Put them in the comments in the blog post. Another sort of framework can use multiple narratives, like for example in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It introduces a collection of different characters, each with their own story and distinct character. The pilgrim who meets these characters is the person that links together the various storytellers' narratives and their relationships with each other. In this type of framework, multiple narratives occur one after the other, so it's fairly linear. You can have a more complex frame system whereby the stories can be nested, which means the reader is introduced to an embedded story by the narrator, and then the character within that embedded story could take the reader off into further story or further sets of stories before coming back to their own story. There are really no limits to how many times or how complex the framework can be and the nesting can be, but obviously it's got to be done carefully so that the reader doesn't get confused. Another example of a framework type story is the Epistolary Tale. This is a story written as a series of documents, such as journals, an exchange of letters, or even newspaper articles. The most famous one that probably most people know is Dracula by Bram Stoker. It's a really, really well-known example. And The Jolly Postman by Janet and Alan Olberg That's a children's book which is very popular at the moment. In fact, my children had it. And that one is where the different stories are told through a series of letters, actual letters in envelopes within the book. And they're delivered by a jolly postman. It's a really lovely book if you've got children. Other examples are Bridget Jones' Diary by Helen Fielding and The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole by Sue Townsend, which if you're an 80s child, you'll be very familiar with. So, for an epistolary tale exercise, what I want you to do is choose one of the following options to create an epistolary tale. So, first option, from your local newspaper, find a reader's letter that feels like there could be an ongoing saga behind it and create a 500-word story through a series of linked letters that you make up that could appear in that paper. Or another option, check the Searching for Love advertisements and create a story around the posts and the people that are creating them. Another option, your story could be made up of a series of journal entries, tweets, or even Tinder entries. Or finally, if you fancy doing something completely different, get an A4 sheet of paper, or bigger if you want, and paste several cut-out letters from newspapers onto it, and then turn that into a visual story. Link those letters by some means to create a story that revolves around the letters, or advertisements, or anything really that you can find and stick onto your piece of paper. It's up to you, it can be really fun. I've got some examples in my blog post so you can have a look at the sort of things I've done with it. And as always, I'd love to see what you've done with them. Put anything you've written into the comments in my blog post. I look forward to seeing you in week 11.